In lecture 4 of module 3, where we're diving deeper into the supply and demand curve, we're going to start to introduce the government. And so remember when we were talking that the United States is a market, has a market system, but that doesn't mean that the government doesn't intervene in any markets. Remember, it's active but limited government. And so what we're going to look at first is what happens when the government introduces price controls. And the first example of a price control is going to be the minimum wage. The government decided that there is something wrong with our market for what economists term unskilled labor. So those who have not yet obtained an education or have decided they prefer not to have an education, and they're often labor-intensive jobs, so something as a starting position in a fast food restaurant would be considered an unskilled labor job, and then these jobs are typically the ones that earn minimum wage. And so the government has come in and said there is a minimum wage that you are by law required to pay your workers. You cannot pay anything less than this wage. And this is what we call a price floor. A minimum wage is a price floor. It's the minimum price for a good or service. And so this service in this case is labor. So it's the minimum wage, the minimum price of labor. And what we're going to find is that when we have a price floor that prevents the market from moving to the equilibrium, it's known as a binding price floor. So what does that mean? A binding price floor or binding minimum wage is going to exist if we have a minimum wage that is preventing the market from moving to equilibrium. And I'm not saying that this is a bad or a good thing. It's just considered binding, and we're going to see what the result of this will be if the market can't move to equilibrium. So what we're going to find is that if the market equilibrium were one price and it's an illegal price, then that becomes a binding price floor. And I think this will make more sense as we go through an example, okay? And once we find a binding price floor, we're going to see this result in a surplus, okay? So if the price floor is not binding, then we're going to stay in equilibrium. If we have a binding price floor, the result will be a surplus. So let's go through an example now. All right, so here we have an initial market, and the price of labor in this case is $6, and at $6, there's 500 hours of unskilled labor that the market is both supplying and demanding. Okay, so we're in equilibrium at this initial price of $6. So now the government comes in and sets a price floor of $5. They say this is the legal minimum. The minimum wage you can charge is $5. Well, workers are already paying their workers $6, and so this is not binding. This is considered a not binding price floor. There is no effect on the market. So the government comes in and says you can't pay your workers less than $5. The employers are saying, well, I'm paying my workers $6, and so it has no effect on me. And so we remain in our equilibrium. The equilibrium price of $6 remains the same, and the equilibrium quantity remains the same. And this is going to be true for any price that's below the equilibrium. Any price below the equilibrium will result in a not binding price floor. Okay, so the price floor will be not binding at any price below equilibrium. And our equilibrium price is the price that will be paid to the workers and received by the workers. And then our equilibrium quantity is the amount that's going to be bought and sold in the market. All right, but what if instead the price floor was set above the equilibrium? So what the government did is they come in and they say the minimum wage that you can pay your workers is $7.25. At any price below $7.25, it is illegal. This is now what we call a binding price floor. The equilibrium price is illegal. $6 is illegal. You can't charge it because the minimum wage you can charge is $7.25. And so we have in this case, and at any price above $6, a price floor would be a binding constraint. We have a binding price floor at any price above $6. And so what we see with this binding price floor is going to be that, let me get my pen ready here, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. And so we can kind of look at this here. So where we hit the demand curve is greater than where we hit the supply curve is greater than where we hit the demand curve. And so when supply is greater than demand, it results in a surplus. And in this case, it's a labor surplus. But we can calculate, again, that's the quantity of surplus that exists by taking the quantity supplied and subtracting the quantity demanded. Okay, so when we have a binding price floor, we forget about the $6. That's illegal. The 500 jobs, that doesn't exist anymore. What exists are there's a quantity supplied and a quantity demanded. And the surplus is the difference between those two. So the quantity supplied is QS, the quantity demanded is QD, and the amount that's going to be bought and sold in the market is then QD. So the price will be equal to that price floor, that binding price floor, and the quantity that will be bought and sold in the market will be QD, because there's only QD people in line to purchase the QS products, so there is actually a surplus going on in the market. All right, so when we have a binding price floor, what we experience is a surplus, and the surplus is the amount, the difference between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. The quantity bought and sold in the market will be QD, and the price will be that price floor. When that price floor was below equilibrium, we just stayed at our equilibrium price and quantity. There was no changes in the market. All right, so let's look at our other example. Rent control is on the other side. In some cities, the government decides that the cost of rent is too high. So they step in and they want to make housing more affordable for the poor. And so instead of having a maximum or a minimum, what they say is, this is the maximum price you can charge. Any price above this rent per month is illegal. Okay, and that's going to be something else, right? This is going to be called a price ceiling. A price ceiling is the legal maximum on a good or service. And so rent control is an example of a price ceiling. And they're saying that the rent in the city is too expensive. Poor people can't afford to live in the city. And so we need to create a legal maximum. The highest price that a landlord can charge is going to be X dollars. All right, and typically they're going to make this low so that the poor can afford it. All right. When the price ceiling prevents the market from moving to equilibrium, it's going to be called binding. So again, we're going to have not binding and then binding price ceilings. And then the result of a binding price ceiling is not a surplus, but it'll be a shortage. So let's look at an example of a price ceiling. So in this market, we see that the rent for apartments is $800. And at this $800, there are 300 apartments that are bought and sold in the market each month. Okay, and so we're right at equilibrium. Okay, now the government comes in and they say the maximum price you can charge for an apartment is $1,000 a month. Any price above $1,000 is illegal. Okay, and how do we tell the difference between a price floor and a price ceiling? Think about it in terms of the ceiling is the maximum, it's the highest place in the room, right? The highest place in the room, whereas a floor is a minimum. It's the lowest place in the room. So when we're thinking about a price ceiling, it's the maximum price that you can charge. Anything above $1,000 is illegal. What this is a not binding price ceiling. There's no effect on the market because the landlords are saying anything above $1,000 is illegal. Well, I'm only charging $800, so I'm not illegal. So there continues to be 300 units bought and sold in the market. We remain in equilibrium. The equilibrium is the price that's paid and received. The equilibrium quantity is the amount that's bought and sold. Okay. But what happens if the government were to instead come along and say that rent is way too expensive, the maximum price you can charge is $500 a month? Well, that instead becomes a binding price floor. That becomes a binding price ceiling. Now, the maximum you can charge is $500. That means $800 is illegal. Those who were charging $800 previously, you can't charge $800 anymore. There's only the highest price you can charge is $500. And we know that the law of demand tells us that as the price decreases, the quantity demanded is going to increase. And so we're not going to be consuming those 300 apartments anymore. Instead, there's going to be 400 people who want apartments. But as the price decreases, the law of supply tells us that the quantity supplied falls, and they fall to 250. And so now, instead of being in equilibrium where we had 300 apartments bought and sold each term, there is 400 people in line to purchase products, but only 250 people get the apartments. And this is a binding constraint. We are unable to move into our equilibrium. And the result is when our quantity demanded is greater than our quantity supplied, we have a shortage. Quantity demand is greater than the quantity supplied. There's more people in line than there are apartments available, and so to determine our shortage, we take the quantity demanded, which in this case is 400, and subtract out 250, which is the quantity supplied, and we see that we are short 150 apartments. Okay, and so when we have this binding price ceiling, we have a shortage, and that shortage is calculated by taking the quantity demanded minus the quantity supplied. All right, so how many apartments are bought and sold in the market? 250. There are 250 apartments available and 400 people in line. Those 250 are bought and sold at $500 each. But the question now becomes, who gets those apartments? And this is where rationing comes in. Typically, our prices ration who gets the goods because it's the buyers who are willing and able to pay the most for them and the sellers who are willing and able to supply them at the lowest cost. And that intersection between our supply and demand curve at equilibrium states that anybody who wants the product at that price gets it. But now we have 400 people who want an apartment, but only 250 people get it. And so we have rationing issues. We have things like black markets that arise. And in cities that have rent control, there is issues where somebody dies and their family rents out that apartment at that lower, they pay the lower rent, but then they charge someone a higher rent. And so there's definitely some black markets that can happen, and also discrimination. I don't want pets in my apartments. I want to discriminate based on gender or race or religion. And so there's many different rationing mechanisms that aren't present when we are in our typical market. Just because there are problems with rationing doesn't mean that there isn't a purpose for rent control or other price ceilings. It just is, there's benefits and there's costs to any sort of government intervention, and one of the costs of this intervention would be the rationing problem. Obviously, a benefit is that it's much more affordable for the poor to pay $500 a month as opposed to $800 a month. All right, so this table just sums up what we're thinking about when we're looking at a price floor, and the price floor is above the equilibrium price. It is considered a binding price floor. But if we have a price floor below the equilibrium price, not binding. And whenever something's not binding, we remain in equilibrium. The equilibrium price is the price that is charged. The equilibrium quantity is the quantity that is charged. When we move to our price ceiling is not binding when it is above the equilibrium, and it will be binding when we move below the equilibrium. Okay, so remember the price floor, the floor is the minimum place in a room, it's the lowest point, and so we're thinking about the minimum price that an individual or firm would be able to charge. A price ceiling is the maximum part of the room, and so therefore we have a binding price, price ceiling is the maximum point in which we can charge. All right, and then just another note, which I should have put in here, when we're talking about a price floor that is above the equilibrium, it results in that surplus, and when we have that binding price ceiling, it results in the shortage. And so to calculate that, we take QD minus QS, and in the surplus case, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, and so we can determine those surplus and shortages by doing those. Ignore equilibrium when you're calculating surpluses and shortages. You should never look at the equilibrium. Look at the price and determine from the price, at that price, what's the quantity demanded, what's the quantity supplied, and the same here. Look at the price ceiling, what's the quantity demanded, what's the quantity supplied. Ignore that equilibrium because both the sellers and the buyers are subject to that binding price constraint. All right, so that concludes our discussion of the binding, of the price controls